Hello, everybody. It is now 1 o'clock. Welcome back to the workshop. I hope everybody had a nice lunch. Had the opportunity to see the end of the World Cup game that just concluded. I'm not gonna say anything in case anyone wants to watch it. Um, but now we are going to be transitioning into our community panel for the next hour. We may need a minute to let everyone reconvene, but I will hand it over to Rob to introduce the panel.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. I want to make sure that I think John and Michael might need to be elevated to presenter. Um, so if Stefan, if you're on, if you could elevate John Kennedy and Michael Garris to presenter, that'd be good. I'm not sure if there's any significant difference, but other than title, I'm not sure. All right. So thank you for joining. You guys can see some slides too. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just stay on these for a brief moment. We are opening the community panel. So I'll do some brief introductions, and after I go through each of your names and your titles, just let me know if you wanted to add anything or if perhaps I got something a little wrong. So today we have John Kennedy, a policy advocate for the Rural County Representatives of California. We have Karen Nelson, a co-chair and founder of the Climate Reality Project, the Silicon Valley chapter. We've got Karen Woodard, the tribal administrator for the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Mark Costa, director of policy and planning, the Energy Coalition, and also a board chair for LGSEC, the Local Government Sustainable Energy Coalition. Michael Garris, director for Department of Planning and Community Development in Yurok Tribe. And also, last but not least, Melissa Kasnitz, legal director for the Center for Accessible Technology. Is there anything else, anything you guys would like to add about in terms of your introduction? No. Okay. And have we got everybody? So I see we've got, is Karen Nelson also present at the moment?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And also, who else is not on screen? I think somebody, I can't tell who it is though. There's only 4, but there should be 6. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see here. So we only have an hour, and you'll have to bear with me. I only have a lot of experience as a panel facilitator. It's my first time doing a panel facilitation today. We want to cover it in 2 parts, and since we do have 6 panelists, we do have to limit the amount of time you could respond to the questions for these 2 parts. The questions I've listed here are from our scoping ruling, and they aren't necessarily conducive to facilitation. And so I do have some questions I shared with you by email earlier today, and I'll put those in the chat, which I think could help you with your comments. And so the part 1 is focused on the outreach and utility presentation that was described today, the distribution planning and community engagement that they currently do. And part 2 of our panel discussion is on the draft scope of work that was also presented today by me and Stefan. And so I'm thinking of this in terms of opening comments and reply comments, which is kind of like how we run our proceeding, but in terms of minutes. So about 3 minutes for your opening comment on part 1, and then you may think of something, and then 1 minute for reply or additional thoughts. If John, thinking of your comment earlier, you have more to say about part 2. I think maybe limit yourself to about 3 minutes in the first part, but if that carries over into your second, it relates any way the questions relate. I think you could just continue in the second part. And if we have time, we'll do some closing remarks. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I am just going to go in order of the introductions. So I'm going to paste into chat the first question and some associated things you may want to consider in your response, but you don't have to limit to yourself to what I'm going to chat in here for everybody. So the question is, how can utilities best include communities in electric distribution system planning? That's the first question. And part 1 does have a second, which is equally important. I'll put in, what are the utilities doing well in terms of outreach, and what needs improvement? And if possible, refer to the utility by name when you're thinking of the second question. So With that, John, I'm putting you on the spot first. I'll turn it over to you.
I'll just jump in real quick. And Rob, you're still sharing your screen.
Oh, okay, thanks. I will stop. There we go. I think I stopped.
Yes.
Great.
John, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. I don't have a formal presentation, but I will definitely cover those questions in my discussion. May go just slightly over 3 minutes, but I want to get everything out. So John Kennedy with RCRC, we represent 40 of California's 58 counties. We really appreciate the role that community engagement needs assessment study may play in long-term planning and operational improvement. There's definitely much room for improvement, but we fear the timeframe envisioned misses the significant and immediate need to drive operational changes at the utilities so they can meet the reliability and capacity needs of the communities they serve. I agree with the other panelists, I believe it was Southern California Edison, that there are two distinct but equally important issues here for distribution planning: growth and reliability. And I think engagement with local governments and stakeholders is vital to ensure that utility distribution planning for both of those meets local needs. So touching on reliability, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the pressing need for energy reliability improvements. We've seen a marked decline in reliability over the last 2 years, 3 years. And that's still true today with over 2,200 outages throughout PG&E's service territory over the last 9 months. We think that could undercut some of the state's electrification goals and climate change goals, so we really need to improve reliability. We appreciate PG&E's efforts to reduce wildfire risk, and we understand they're doing a lot of work on the hundreds of circuits impacted by those outages, but it's not clear to local governments what actions PG&E is taking on each individual circuit to increase reliability and reduce the probability of an outage. So closing this loop with locals is vital, and it may just be a matter of information sharing. Concerning growth, the existing distribution planning process appears to be broken because of severe unmet needs and exceedingly long connection timeframes. 2 to 4 years appears to be common in some utility service territories, but we've heard some counties say 5 to 7 years, 8 years is also encountered. This leaves some applicants with few alternatives other than to either site their project in another utility service territory, including out of state, or to rely on large diesel generators until the incumbent utility can provide service. That is really not a great option in some of those communities that have air quality burdens, like the Central Valley, like South Coast. Unfortunately, some local economic development officials have indicated that one of the biggest impediments to local economic growth is the inability to connect those projects to the grid in a timely manner. What's worse, there oftentimes seems to be utility indifference to those frustrations and the unreasonableness of the length of time to do system upgrades. So it's encouraging that Southern California Edison surveys elected officials and senior staff throughout their service territory as to distribution needs. Hearing from our members, that's something that's desperately needed. It's eye-opening that PG&E doesn't appear to have done so and seems to have relied largely on previously submitted applications to inform planning efforts. This could well have contributed to the failure of the existing distribution plans to meet current needs. At the same time, we do appreciate PG&E's plans to revamp its process and to ask locals about development plans and needs, local priorities, and governmental projects with critical timelines. This latter is especially important as local governments often receive state and federal grants with clear project deadlines. The community development block grants aren't uncommon, especially after disasters. Butte County recently received a grant for about $200 million for wildfire rebuilding. While the county was originally told it would take about 60 days to connect those housing units and projects to the grid, that was extended to a full year by the utility. And I've also got to note that these efforts to improve distribution planning are important, but it's a two-way street. There needs to be transparency for local governments to better understand the existing capacity of the distribution system. Our counties are planning and trying to determine where to site future housing and other projects to meet state and local needs. Lake County reached out to PG&E for information on existing system capacity to better inform those planning efforts, but it's now been about 7 months and they've still heard nothing back from the utility. I don't know if other locals are asking similar questions, but there needs to be a forum where locals can better understand the distribution system so they can figure out
John,
where
would this
to
be a
locate
spot where
development.
we could sort of just pause? Is that okay? And hear what the other locals on the panel have to think? Or
I've
could
got
you
about
wrap
20
up
seconds.
quickly?
About
Yeah.
20 seconds left.
got it.
So just let me close. So utilities need to be prepared to share this information with local governments. At a minimum, utilities should meet regularly with local governments, including their planners and local economic development officers, to determine future anticipated needs. And utilities need to be more nimble in the distribution improvements to timely connect those projects that weren't anticipated in the most recent distribution plans. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So next would be Karen Nelson. How can the utilities best include communities in distribution system planning?
Well, first of all, my comment will be much shorter, so we'll catch up that way.
Okay.
First of all, I think that the range on question one, the range of your topics for planning is pretty accurate. I mean, I would say that we really need to focus on not only preparing for outages, the typical things that we've been thinking about for a long time, but moving forward, we really need to be thinking about, how is the, and this is what you've been talking about all morning, the distribution grid going to change? And with, the distributed energy is going to massively change, and reaching out to the communities who care about that, the CBOs, et cetera, and using existing mechanisms to reach out to those folks. I mean, I think you're planning to do that, but I think that is pretty essential to, and I think you can do that pretty quickly. I really think that I didn't hear solar mentioned much in the conversation. I think we need to think about rooftop solar as playing an important role in sort of reducing, meeting our 2045 targets. I think that's essential, and I really hope that rooftop solar is considered a viable, important option, and it's protected. And that includes the equity considerations around rooftop. And another thing I didn't mention that I think you need to incorporate into how you look at all the different aspects of the question one is the equity question. But in terms of equity, your local governments, your CCAs are doing a lot right now to build equity and climate justice into the work they're doing around energy. And so we don't want to ignore that when you're doing the planning. You really need to pay attention to all the rebates and various subsidy mechanisms that are going on to make sure that you encourage that, you support that, and that it provides a balanced approach. Because again, I come from being in climate reality. I come from what are we doing to manage our fossil fuel consumption to move towards a climate safe environment. And we have very few years to go. We need to move quickly. And that needs to be a consideration in what you're doing.
Thank you, Karen. I just realized my camera wasn't on. Sorry about that. But Karen, thank you for all those comments. So Karen Woodard, you'd be next. And the same question, how can utilities best include communities in distribution planning, and what are they doing well? What could they do better?
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me on this panel. As you mentioned, I'm a tribal administrator for the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. We generally work with Southern California Edison. As far as our communication with Southern California Edison, and I'm going to speak from a tribal government standpoint because I'm not involved in the other communities, local governments. Southern California Edison and the tribe have a very good relationship. We work together on current projects that are on the tribal lands, being generally housing or economic development. So they've done really well at sharing our resilience reports. We have monthly meetings on our projects. what could be improved and how could they reach out. Tribal communities, there's a lot of tribal communities that don't have a large tribal government. They may only have, less than a dozen people that work on the tribal government side. A lot of them are still working on either trying to get housing on their reservation. Some are trying to just get utilities to their reservation. I think that our tribes, or I mean, the Southern California Edison could do a better job at reaching out to those individual tribes. And if they don't get any communication back, then to reach out to another tribe that, does have communication there, or reaching out to different tribal organizations, whether it be gaming or cultural groups. There are many tribal organizations that are available for those individuals to reach out to. Planning is not well known in Indian country. Tribes with gaming, especially in California, has given us that economic engine, but planning tribal lands has not been in the forefront. That's probably becoming more in the forefront in the last probably 15, 20 years. So a little bit behind the curveball on that. But as we move forward on our planning efforts, utility planning has become in the forefront. Our reservation, which is located in Southern California, along the I-10 freeway, 15 minutes west of Palm Springs, has not had great energy production. We have a lot of outages, and that was because of redundancy. We're kind of like on the end of the artery. When power goes out, we don't get power. So that's a big issue for us, is reliability, resiliency. We're looking at becoming a tribal utility district. So being involved with the CPUC has been very helpful for us. Improvements, they could do more educational workshops, especially for tribes, to get them educated, on electricity issues that are going to be, and also talking more about the grid distribution system and what that is going to look like in the future.
Great, thank you, Karen. So off to Mark. So how best can utilities include communities in distribution system planning? What are they doing well? What are they doing not so well?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. So these will be based on primarily the local government perspective. And so for local governments, to get right into it, I think a lot of times pre-screening the facilities for interconnection capacity is a big barrier a lot of times with larger facilities. And with the advent of a new resolution that's out there on nameplate rating and versus limited generation profiles, that can open the door to a lot of projects that otherwise would have been cost prohibitive. But in a broader sense, it does seem like the distribution system planning needs a paradigmatic shift in a shared vision. And, it's a question whether or not we're putting the cart before the horse in articulating what the distribution system operator role looks like in the penetration of DERs that are needed either by state legislation to meet SB 100 goals or 2045 decarbonization goals, or even those local goals in the jurisdiction that may accelerate that. And also, a lot of communities have, at the local government level, have high ambitions for 100% renewables, and even ambitions for 100% customer or community self-sufficiency. So in that scenario, it would be very helpful to understand what does the grid need and how does that align or not with the motivations of the distribution system operator. And if that's the case, feedback may not be taken well. So we need to acknowledge that that's a real possibility. We also might want to look at what does an open access, non-discriminatory distribution system look like? And again, if that's not in alignment with business plans of the utilities, how can that happen? And what's the likelihood that the current planning would not allow such a system? Local governments also have SB 379 requirements for local planning. A lot of times includes renewables. So there's this dimension bus sometimes between what is legislated versus what's regulated. There's also scenario for triaging critical infrastructure, essential infrastructure. There's a lot of different words for it. And also what the LA County did in their cascading impacts analysis, showing if the grid goes down, what else would go down? We know that in some cases, natural gas won't be, electronically pumped around. Cell towers can go down, so that critical planning aspect is good. Local governments do also have, big input in community scale planning, not just their own assets. Maybe that's best addressed by some of the other panelists. And then, we might also want to consider how regional energy networks in the EE proceeding could extend the notion of local government partnerships, and see how that expands into the IDSM world if that is integrated into the EE portfolios as the testimony that was submitted on, I think, November 21st, and the subsequent ruling and decisions that come from that would allow. Just very quickly on the outreach, the one point I'll make on that, and then I'll pass it off, is that local governments are large in some cases and have a lot of departments, and there needs to be a layered approach to make sure that the dots are being connected between the offices at the county level of emergency services, the state level, but then also the sustainability planners, perhaps the permitting planners, the urban planners, the planning departments, land use, zoning, all that. So just having one person invited to these meetings may fall short of a larger cohesive effort at each local government. So it might not make sense just for one point of contact to be informed, and cast a wider net would be the advice on question number 2. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So now to you, Michael, same 2 questions, and to everyone and to you, thank you for joining today. I think I forgot to say that, but to Michael.
Hello, everybody. I just want to start with commending the way that the CPUC is approaching this. I think it's very exciting, and I think that what you've shown in the scope of work that you have plans to advertise for is looking right on. And I want to say that planning, when we're looking at questions around planning for growth and reliability, I think we need to add a few things. And one is that there needs to be processes of engagement for communities seeking independence from the grid rather than looking to add loads to it, or even seeking independence in combination with contributing more power to the grid. I know that's a form of loading if there's a aspiration to sell power back to the grid, but I think that that's not explicitly been discussed, and that we should look at the reasons for that, and recognize that energy independence as it's being planned by the Yurok tribe is part and parcel with sovereignty and self-determination, and is a means to address equity gaps that have existed on the Yurok reservation for a very long time, where over 60% of the households on the upper reservation, which is a significant portion of the reservation, do not have grid power. That whole portion of the reservation would not have grid power should the Yurok tribe planning department not have raised the funds and built that infrastructure, which now PG&E operates. So, I think that given that historical context, when tribes decide to take matters into their own hands, communities decide to take matters into their own hands, that's something that we should consider very explicitly, and recognize that there should be ways to support that. Just speaking for the Yurok tribe, it is a large tribal government, and I wouldn't worry about fatigue. We haven't had meaningful conversations about planning with PG&E, so I think there's a long way to go when we're talking about potentially fatiguing staff and the Yurok tribe. So, bring it on. I think that if there's, planning efforts that are underway or being considered anywhere in Yurok ancestral territory, the Yurok tribe wants to be there. These things can be designed jointly, especially in consideration of what the tribe is developing for itself independently and how PG&E's infrastructure can change to accommodate that. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I appreciate the time.
Great, Michael. And we'll come back to you if you think of something else. So Melissa, off to you. Same two questions, and thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm Melissa Kasnitz. I'm the legal director with the Center for Accessible Technology. We regularly represent the interests of utility customers with disabilities and medical needs, and particularly those who depend on a reliable supply of electricity to support their health and safety. Unlike the other panelists here, my constituency is not a geographic community of interest, so that makes our needs a little bit different. Although I should say people with disabilities are everywhere and in every community. And so both local governments and utilities need to regularly take the needs of people with disabilities into consideration. And in fact, local governments have often been left holding the bag in providing emergency support for my constituents when the power is out, particularly with de-energization in terms of wildfire risk, where the utilities haven't provided supports, local governments have had to fill in the needs to protect people's safety. So while my community isn't geographically clustered, they are highly impacted, highly dependent on reliable electricity for health and safety, to run medical equipment, to run power wheelchairs, to keep insulin refrigerated. Lack of power is a big concern for people's health. My constituency also struggles in accessing support from resources that are intended to provide backup. They're disproportionately low income, so purchasing backup power resources is difficult, or other preparation. Sometimes community resources are not designed to be accessible, or accessible transportation isn't provided, so getting to an evacuation location can be challenging. And so the needs are widespread. Communication can be challenging for people with disabilities. So there needs to be ongoing focus. There needs to be a breakdown of silos. It's very frustrating how many times I've had conversations with utility representatives, suggested the need for accessible format communication, and been told, oh, what a great idea. We really need to get on that, making sure our website is designed to be accessible. And, I've been in these conversations with the utilities for 18 years, and routinely I find someone who's hearing it for the first time. So that's an ongoing source of frustration. So we really need improvement in breaking silos across the utilities, making sure that the needs of the most vulnerable people, including my constituents, are always on the table when these planning needs are being considered, and not feeling like any community isn't obligated to consider the needs of their customers with disabilities when they're making these planning decisions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. What I'd like to do is go back to each of you to see if you've had any new thoughts on the first topic, and then we'll come back and spend some time on the scope of work. So, John, did you think of anything? I know you had probably more to say. You have a lot more to say, but anything else you want to add just quickly in a minute or so, in less than a minute?
So yeah, just a couple thoughts on the meeting fatigue issue. I get it. I get that it's real, especially for some things. I think this is an issue that's of such importance to so many that I don't think meeting fatigue will be an issue on this topic. And I think you'll find a ready audience among a lot of the higher level staff officials in the local government arena, especially among the local economic development officers, both at the local, regional, and whatever statewide officers or associations there may be. there are different points of contacts, as some people mentioned, and so I think it's important to get at the county administrators, the city managers, the local economic development people as some of the higher profile ones, and then planning chiefs, things like that. Someone mentioned about pre-screening applications to see if there's something there. I've heard from some project proponents that they come in and they have to spend a lot of money on the application process, only to find out there's no way that they're ever going to get electrical service where they've acquired property or something else. So maybe demystifying and making that a more accessible process for project applicants could be helpful as well. And then Southern California Edison, PG&E, kudos for using your local regional people to meet with local electeds. I think PG&E, with your development of a regional model, there are so many more opportunities to get your executive managers out in the field to meet the local elected officials and to have some of these private conversations and figure out what needs to be done and what's important for the communities. So thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Off to Karen Nelson. Great hearing from you. Anything else to add based on others' thoughts and comments?
Not at this time. I'm really anxious to talk about part 2. Going to
okay, great. Karen Woodward, thanks. Same question to you.
No, I don't really have any comments at the moment. Thank you.
Great. And Mark, anything to add based on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just point out that the business units for the utilities have been really successful over the past for energy efficiency. So just kudos around the horn to utilities for that. And I'm wondering, as we go into this new era of grid interactive buildings and getting more savvy on the supply side in the T&D world, maybe there's something there. But I do want to remind folks that, in the microgrid proceeding, there were very explicit orders to build that capacity and actually have the ability to compensate and recover those costs through rates. And nearly every single one of the ordering paragraphs was shirked by the utility. So I just wanted to caveat that for any follow-up from this, that, we can be as prescriptive as we want and micromanaging for better or worse through ordering paragraphs, but the follow-through is really the key.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'll say that if the state's planning to continue to rely on and pursue the IOU model, I think that what's become apparent to the UROC Planning Department, not just with the planning of energy infrastructure, but other infrastructures as well, is that the state's really, in a lot of cases, our best partner and who we're relying on here to ensure that an infrastructure is built that's pursuant to the welfare of Californians, and I hope that continues to be a goal here, and that there are long-term regulatory outcomes here that do prescribe and that are very adamant about community engagement in ways that communities determine to be meaningful. The tribe, the UROC tribe, is pursuing microgrids, is pursuing funding, is under the process of planning for an independent UROC owned and operated grid, and we see, as many others I'm sure here do, due to their rural location and low number of users, that it's challenging when you're running infrastructures to generate revenue capable of supporting that operations and maintenance. And I think that there are really great opportunities that the state has now for changing policy, changing regulation to the extent that those utilities that do form around DER can generate revenue locally through selling power back to the grid, for instance. And I think that would be part of the state's considerations when looking at what individual communities are doing for the development of energy independence. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Michael. And Melissa, based on what you've heard so far, anything you'd like to add?
Just briefly, going back to the issue of meeting fatigue, I appreciate that local and tribal governments, as well as the utilities, have people whose job is to be involved in this sort of planning issue. With regard to advocates and CBOs, usually what they're being asked to do is on top of their regular job. They're being asked to make contributions and provide input, which isn't their day-to-day, what they're expected to do. So for those participants, I've said this before, people are probably bored of it, but resources really are needed. If you're asking a CBO to attend regular meetings and put the homework and preparation and thought into doing it, that's time they're not spending doing the other parts of their job. And so they need to be able to focus on their core mission and not divert their resources away from that in order to help the utilities do their planning. And so there's been a lot of effort to do better at compensating CBOs for the time and energy that they put into community partnerships, and that needs to continue to be a piece of the puzzle. Thank you.
That's great comment. Thank you, Melissa. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second part. And there's one question for this part. I just put it in the chat. I'll read it out. So what should be the scope of outreach? Talking about the scope of work presentation now from today. What should be the scope of outreach by a to-be-hired future consulting team in coordination with CPUC staff in the 2023 to 2024 timeframe, roughly? Oh, I lost it. I can't read it from chat. To support decision-making for the high DER proceeding, objectives to investigate existing utility distribution planning processes and to improve those processes as needed. So I've listed a couple of things to help you start thinking about how you might answer. And John, I know I'm not sure if you have much to add on this, but just let us know if you got something. I'll start with you.
All right. I don't think I have a lot, but thank you. I think, first of all, the time frame for delivery of the study, as quickly as we can get this done so that we can move forward and operationalize these improvements is important. But would strongly encourage the PUC and utilities to not wait until the study's done to operationalize these improvements. SCE, PG&E, to the extent you're reaching out and trying to improve your internal processes, hats off to you. Let us help you with that. Bounce some ideas off of us, off of the other local stakeholders here, and make your process better, because we all need to move forward on this together. I think this universe of stakeholders is a good start. I think expanding on this universe of stakeholders, including others in the same spaces, is great. But the ones that I don't seem to see here are the local economic development people, the ones who deal with these applicants who are seeking to bring new opportunities, job opportunities, hospitals, other things to a region. I think engaging them and getting their honest and candid feedback on how this system could work better would be incredibly helpful moving forward.
Great. Thank you, John. I'll turn now to Karen Nelson. I think you had a few ideas for this question.
Yeah, first of all, let me say thanks so much. This is a great next step to deepen the conversation between you and the community. I really appreciate it. Yeah, a couple of things from the CBO climate sort of perspective or volunteer organization perspective. A little small idea is I would really recommend that some of your meetings that are really focused on the volunteer folks be after 5 o'clock. We have a lot of people who are very intelligent, very interested in this topic, but they work full time, and being able to take off for meetings is difficult. So that's a minor thing. And as you engage in the conversation, I really think it would be wise to think about, in terms of types of outreach, think about new ways or ways that so far the CPUC hasn't handled it, to engage the community. And because what you really want to do is mobilize the community. There are many of us who are very interested, but I think ideally the best way to find the right solutions is to engage a broader community. And so I think one of the ways to do that is to build a really community-focused website. Currently the CPUC has a website that's good for the folks who want to dive deep into CPUC, but something like, I think I mentioned this in another meeting, the switch is on type of website that's really easy to navigate, and really also not only provides the information that and messages that you want people to dwell on and speak about, but that you have sort of a social media element in that website that provides not only two-way communication between, singular communication between you and the community, but allows the community to talk with each other. Because I would bet that after today's meeting, many of us, if we had yet another meeting where we would just talk to each other or communicate via, email, would build on our ideas, and you would end up with a better process. So I think a social media style website, easy to navigate, available to everyone, even if they aren't part of a CBO or a formal community that might ongoing work on the subject, but they might have an idea that you want to pull from. So that's, I think, would really be helpful. And, in terms of the length, I really think that there's no end to this process. I really think in many ways it's ongoing for a number of reasons. And one of which is that, as you all mentioned, that things are really rapidly changing with distributed energy, and it's going to continue to change. And so what people feel is important now may not be important, may not be the priority, or exactly the same perspective we have today. In 3 years, it may be very different. So I really think, instead of thinking of this as, and I know you've got a scope of work to get through the first phase, but I really think this is an ongoing process that I really think a consulting firm could be of value to ongoing, because it provides fresh idea. Those folks, that's their business. They provide fresh ideas, new ways of looking at things that are out of the box, that all of you, at the utilities and CPUC, you've got a lot of, your work is challenging, and you don't necessarily have the time to reach out in a way that a consulting firm would about all the nuances of new outreach. So I would say, think of it as an ongoing process in some fashion. I think that really, I just really want you to think out of the box about outreach, and have your consulting firm do that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Karen. Let's move forward to Karen Woodard. Any thoughts about this scope of work that was presented? What should be in it? What looked good? What maybe not so good? What are your thoughts?
I'd like to have a dictionary of acronyms.
Yes, it's true. It's a joke that comes up all the time, honestly, with our staff, that all the acronyms. It's true. It's not a joke. It's real. Yeah.
Definitely, Karen. I think the outreach does need to be, thinking out of the box, not your usual, focus group, workshops. There needs to be some incentive for communities to engage in this process. It's not something that you can just pick up and run with. There's a lot of education and that needs to be brought to the forefront. We need to understand how all of our grids are going to come together. So I think there needs to be some education on that distribution system. But Karen had some great suggestions as far as, coordination and website would be a great idea. And
Karen, did you have a chance to see the utility presentation from today, or any thoughts maybe on the education they provided on distribution planning?
I apologize, but I was kind of multitasking this morning between tribal council.
Yeah, I put you on the spot. But it sounds like more of that. It's more education on how the grid works is probably going to be needed. So.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Over to Mark. So about the scope of work today, what are your thoughts? What needs to be in there?
Yeah, good points. I would just say acknowledging that, a high DER future is coming, especially with IRA funds. And so focusing on existing buildings would really be the key. So maybe reorient that to point those out as examples instead of some of the new developments. And really couch the outreach around how can the DSOs minimize capital investments through smart orchestrated DERs and smart inverters. I think there needs to be some kind of objective and framing in the outreach that could be really helpful. And then also some case studies. So, one of the roles I play is I'm on the Gridwise Architecture. It's a DOE group that's, for the last decade has been really articulating that vision and being led by PNNL. So they've, brought in the speakers of the Puerto Rico grid operator, how they're rebuilding that, or spoken about LA 100, or have something on the DSO plus T study from PNNL. Or looking at what Australia's done with decentralizing their energy grid. I think we need some tangible examples of what the future looks like. Or even hold some kind of forum. I mean, I'm organizing one where I'm having people from Croatia, from Belgium, from Colombia, from all over the world come and talking about, what do new markets look like? What does the peer-to-peer market look like? What are the regulatory barriers? And so tapping into the international community, maybe as some homework and then presenting that to the stakeholders would be helpful. So case studies could be helpful. And that way it can kind of spark the imagination of community members where this is new. I mean, unless you do this on a daily basis, which there's only a handful of people that do, would get it. So that some education would be helpful. We could send some specific feedback on the actual plan. I skimmed it last night. Things like updating figure 1 with a more robust detail of what community feedback looks like. A little more than 3 boxes might do it justice. The focus on existing buildings rather than new construction, and then really inserting local governments into those areas of outreach in addition to CBOs, and the other constituents listed could be helpful. And so that capacity building and knowledge transfer, I would say, would be very helpful. And I would say providing very clear information on what non-wire alternatives look like, and what is going to break the grid in a way that's whatever can be shared. Not everything can be shared, and really point to technical potentials, not economic potential, in terms of behind the meter or customer-owned assets coming online. I think would be really helpful to see. What's that upper limit? Like where is somebody going to be refused an interconnection request? And then what can you do about it? You may have some great data from the Kavala study. And if at those meetings with specific stakeholders, if they're jurisdiction specific, can any homework be done and show people an ICA map and say, hey, you can't connect resources here, or hey, your city hall, you can only tap it out at this much solar and maybe storage, or whatever that might look like, and really understand how to avoid the cost causation principle. Not that it's an unjust rule or thing that we follow, but we need to understand it because it's really prevented projects from happening. So a little homework before engaging a geographic specific stakeholder group. And then also within the scope, having very clear criteria for how the feedback is actually going to be adopted and whether or not it would, to whatever extent you can define that. And then a feedback loop to monitor, what feedback was taken and a justification why it wasn't. Not every piece of input can be taken, but, understanding why things are more helpful than not could be very helpful. And then a little bit of understanding about local or state law impacts at the community scale, whatever they've implemented either at the local level or have to comply with at the state level, and how that comports with system planning, and whether or not system planning may be the limiting constraint in terms of achieving community objectives. So I'll leave it there, but I'm sure there's a lot more in the document to go over and more comments to come.
Thank you, Mark. Lots of good technical comments, and you'll notice in the document, the appendix, I think we listed all of the different studies and journal articles you provided regarding big data use and analytics. And so that's in the appendix to the draft scope of work. So moving forward, you got it. To Michael, thoughts about this scope of work?
Thank you. I would always start with suggesting coming to the reservation. You know, we've been visited by the CPUC several times, and those are always really beneficial visits to be there and to see firsthand, to hear firsthand. That's always where I would start, and I think that this group, when they're hired, would find that the Yurok tribe is not alone in you know, taking advantage of of funding and planning capacity and local partnerships. And there's a lot of planning that's underway in regard to energy infrastructure that a group who visited, I think, would benefit to learn from. And that doesn't, you know, and I think that those individual meetings with individual communities is always your place to start. But what also you'll find is in Northern California, the Yurok tribe, for instance, will be meeting with the Karuk tribe and the Hupa tribe this Friday to discuss their individual energy planning efforts and how they may be interconnected, where there may be collaboration, and what issues need to be addressed. And so those planning efforts are happening locally, and I would invite, you know, PG&E, CPUC, and a group who's contracted as part of this scope of work to question, you know, what processes precede them or are occurring right now independently from them in some instances, and how they may integrate to support it. And you know, in scaling out from there, I'm just seeing some really helpful comments in the chat already in regard to just small points that I may have made, and hearing in other people's experiences that you know, there's probably a lot of continuity of concerns between community groups who are out there looking to respond to energy justice issues. And I think it was a great suggestion that there may be opportunity to bring those groups together for more dialogue. And I'll just conclude by saying, I think, again, you know, the way that CPUC is engaging with this process is commendable, and thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And now to you, Melissa, on the scope of work presentation and the contents, if you had a chance to skim through it a bit, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's been a lot of really useful input for how to get feedback from some folks who are more technically engaged. But to the extent that you are reaching out to individuals or small, truly community-based CBOs that aren't focused on energy issues and don't have that technological background, I think you need to recognize that not everyone really is going to have the opportunity or even interest in really understanding in depth how the grid works. So there needs to be an opportunity for some less technical feedback and input as well. People who want to talk about what their needs are and make sure that their needs are being heard and responded to without understanding the distribution process or what DERs are and what the different load serving entities are. And I've been doing this stuff for a very long time, but from a policy angle, and I still am baffled by most of the technical stuff. So you need to have a way for feedback from folks who don't have the capacity or interest in going up that learning curve to still be heard and considered. You also need to recognize there's a catchphrase about hard to reach communities, and often you don't stop and think that hard to reach communities are in fact hard to reach. And so they're sort of brushed off. Oh, we'll do language outreach in English and Spanish, but no other languages, because other languages are hard and those populations are smaller. Well, yeah, those communities are hard to reach. People who aren't computer literate or don't have reliable internet access, and so can't be served by a website and social media. How do we reach out to them? I certainly can't speak to the tribal populations that others are speaking to that don't have reliable grid connectivity, but how do you reach them? There's always some efforts to reach HTR populations, but I think there needs to be regrouping and saying that's not just another acronym. These people are genuinely hard to reach. And what do we do to try to engage them, knowing they're pressed for time, knowing maybe they're working 2 jobs and don't speak English? How on earth do you find that person and try to get them to care? And these aren't easy things to do, but the fact that they're hard shouldn't mean that they're dismissed altogether.
Great, those are excellent points. Thank you, Melissa. And we do have time to go back, and I think John, just real briefly, maybe less than a minute, I'll go to everyone. It sounds like you've heard something you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Ms. Kastnitz mentioned about barriers on how we talk about some of these things. Some of the terms that are used are very intimidating to people who aren't familiar with the PUC world, with the energy world, and intimidating to even those that do have some fluency in the area. So finding a way to make this intelligible to the audience that you're trying to talk to, I think is probably one of the most important objectives here.
Great, that's an excellent point. Thank you, John. And to Karen Nelson?
Yeah, I just want to underscore the importance of what Mark said about the feedback loop. And I think that this is something that can actually is off-putting to many people who want to be involved, but if they feel like they're not being heard, then they will stop communicating. And so, the feedback loop really should include, in terms of how you make a person feel heard, is you explain why what they're suggesting would work or not work, that you give them reasons behind that. And I also think that, somehow you need to develop a willingness to rethink your ideas and to acknowledge that sometimes, and that's what you're doing today, really, is to really broaden your ideas, understand how you could do a better job with the scope of work. But to let people know that, to not just absorb it and then do it, but to communicate it back to people how you've made changes to what you're doing based on what you're hearing today and in the future. I think just rethinking, communication, subtly making changes in that. And I really do appreciate the concept of really thinking out of the box for the hard to reach communities. I think that's something we all tend to forget about, and it is so important.
Hard to reach HTR communities. That's a good point. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Melissa, for that. Karen, Woodard, less than a minute. Anything you'd like to add on based on something you heard today?
Maybe establishing a tribal energy group so the tribes can get more involved, can coordinate and collaborate together on their energy needs, how they are going to be affected by the upcoming changes with the grid. So I think that's a big takeaway for me. But
yeah, I remember that coming up in one of our meetings. It's a very interesting idea. I like that one. Thank you. So Mark, anything you'd like to add today?
Rob, amazing job, not just today, but, since the inception of the proceeding, and, to the commissioner for giving, you, Rob, and your team the ability to do the homework and get this right. So awesome job there. I'll just say, as far as the equity component goes, I think we need to think pretty hard about what it means to not leave people behind. And what does that mean? Does it mean that they are second from the last from being behind? Does that mean they're first in line and having first mover advantage? So to really figure out what that means could be a very important part of this. And so I'll just echo that and everything else that I agree with all the other panelists. So great job.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We'll go to Michael and then Melissa, and we'll wrap up. So to Michael.
Yeah, I think that the idea of a hub or a advisory group panel, whatever you may call it, for tribes is something that was discussed not only today, but I've heard from the CPUC in the past, and I love that idea, especially if it can be accompanied by technical assistance, and tribes can be assisted in moving through those various thresholds of complexity or specificity that arise during a planning project. There seems to be always need for more expertise. So that's certainly something that we're always looking for. And then, you know, it's a huge task. What this consultant has before them. I think just given the amount of diversity that we've heard from not only the panelists but commenters on the chat about, you know, capacities, interests, needs, you know, equity issues. And I know that there's always a reason to want to look for engagement strategies and other you know, outputs that are replicable and scalable. But I think that you know, it's worth the added investment in time, in funding, in, you know, in whatever else it might take to be very specific to the needs of all of the communities that are being worked with and engaged with here. And you know, it adds exponentially to the scope, but I think that's something that I would encourage you all to do. And thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. And in the next hour, we will have Q&A. Some of the questions that have come up in chat while we've been talking, you may be able to respond to, or maybe would like to respond to. So you'll have that opportunity as panelists in the next hour. But with that, Melissa, anything to add on the scope of work based on what you've heard, kind of to wrap up this session with the community panel?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this work that you've done to put today's presentations and gathering together. And the goal of effectively integrating this form of community feedback is so important. My organization is technically a party to the larger proceeding, but we haven't actively participated prior to now because the community input elements of the proceedings and the highly technical elements of the proceedings have been so difficult to tease apart that I haven't had the resources as a small organization to wade through the highly technical areas where I don't really have a lot of input to find those strands where my input might be more helpful. So I appreciate that this project is looking to do that to some extent. And I would encourage ongoing, if you go back and look at my opening comments on the OIR and the formal proceeding, I said, hey, maybe have an equity track that's teased out so groups like mine can be more involved on those areas. And the answer was, well, equity is everywhere. But if equity is everywhere, it's kind of nowhere because it's so hard for smaller groups to look at everything and find those places to give feedback. So I really appreciate this outreach project and this community needs assessment because it's a more focused way of doing that. And I urge the commission and policymakers to think carefully about how grandiose statements that equity is everywhere actually make it harder to prioritize equity. Small participants.
Well, thank you. I'm also very appreciative. And one thing I've learned in the last couple of months doing the outreach is how willing a diverse groups are to talk with us. It was the feedback that we received was very quick. You all had very little notice of this workshop, honestly, and you were happy to participate. And I'm just so grateful that you did. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tyler, if you're there, to kind of lead us into the next part.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. Let's get some applause reactions in the meeting. And thank you to the panelists and also to Rob for facilitating. So next, we will be moving into a Q&A session. And as we get some questions into the chat, I think there's a few already, but I would also just like to read some of the comments that came up throughout that the panelist session. So from Christian Cruz, he says, also as it pertains to the planning and development process, being forthright and clearly indicating the potential impact on the workforce and economic development in the area and the intended mitigation of local pollution can help. We have another comment from LaPierre about appreciating Michael Jarris's comments regarding grid independence. We know from our research that there is no requirement to connect to utilities. It is interesting to think about microgrids as being one way of helping reduce the stress on the grid. Thank you. These are really interesting and good points. We have another comment from LaPierre. A very long comment, but I think to summarize, it is very frustrating that there are long interconnection times and it is costly to a lot of people who are enduring these long interconnection times. We would like a less cumbersome process. Imagine if this was a system for a nonprofit, which didn't have the ability to fund the system without having the energy offsets from the system. So yeah, there are definitely potential big downsides to these long interconnection times. We have another comment from Christian Cruz. Obtaining data on who is receiving information is critical. If, for example, an email blast went out, but the metrics indicate that the open rate of that community is very low, then the outreach strategy can be adjusted. Having not just one plan of outreach, but backup outreach plans can ensure better engagement and ensured feedback is provided by those most impacted, which will support decision making. I think that's a really great point.
Hey, Tyler, I'll add one too.
Yeah.
This is an important point. I noticed Jennifer West, and it came up the concept of a burnout. Some groups not under-engaged, some groups, well, over-engaged, and this is a group that would like more engagement. So she's saying that their local government partnership in Alameda and Contra Costa counties ended in 2020. And since then, no longer have formal engagement with PG&E. And so it just really varies by group. But I think we are hearing that local governments and the tribes are hard to burn out on this topic because energy is so important.
Yeah, I think that this could speak to a important part of the draft scope of work, which is the development of a database that kind of tracks the comments from different groups that we're engaging with. And so that would be pretty critical for helping us understand who has the capacity to engage more and who we need to be a little bit more selective with our engagement and make sure that we engage on key decisions and key times and make it more accessible to them as well. Getting back to some more comments we have one from Laureen. In terms of outreach, the first point of contact is the invoice and the electric bill. This needs to be rethought. Also being able to talk to a live person if you need to when you call the utility. These are points of contacts from which trusts and partnerships start.
Good comment.
Yeah, another comment from Laureen. We would like to hear more about the results from this summer on communities' abilities to respond to alerts and etc. during heat stress on grid. What tools that tool may have promise? Were some communities more likely to respond than others? There are lots of questions, and what feedback did communities have? Did people trust it? I think those are good questions because that that outreach, that blast was pretty critical to the heat waves that we had this summer in reducing load. And those are great questions. And I'm not sure I don't have the answers to that, but
I don't have the answers. It may could come up again in the confines of this outreach that we do. But before then, I know it's already come up. But by the time we get to this outreach, it may still be on the agenda.
In the meantime, we have not received any more questions. I just want to reiterate that we are taking questions on any parts of this workshop that that we've discussed so far. So anything from the scope of work, the utilities distribution planning process, and community engagement outreach, and as well as the panel that we just completed.
Yeah, any other comments to chat, or I see a hand raised here from Bill.
Hi there, thanks. Yeah, maybe a question on the scope of work and kind of the timelines and just some things I kind of picked up on in the panel. And more like the near-term efforts, thinking from, PG&E's perspective, we presented on some what we're doing now and what we might want to do in the future to improve. And I'm wondering if, the scope of work, how can, as utilities, we get involved and kind of make those near-term improvements? Right? John Kennedy, I think you mentioned, some aspects of that, like let's not just end up with like a report and then start improving the process. And maybe some of this funding could be used, more directly to create a process now and process improvement now, so that it can be more sustainable in the future. So like if we're learning as we're doing it, then we can implement it while we're doing it, and then it doesn't have to wait until the report, and maybe less focus on the report part is what I'm kind of suggesting here. Curious what your thoughts are, but that's just one takeaway that I've had.
If you have thoughts, any of the panelists, feel free to join in. We have another hand raised, I see, from Anu.
Hi, this is Anuj Desai. Thank you all. Excuse me. I just wanted to just briefly introduce myself before the question. You heard earlier from my colleague Zanku about the community engagement work that we did around climate adaptation in the morning, and I was largely responsible for that work, and I've been trying to listen in and kind of understand how that being one of our kind of deeper engagement experiences, how what's being proposed today may relate to some of that work and the experience I've had there. And the question that I had around this was just, as the three or so scenarios that were presented to us today around PUC staff involvement and so forth, just to build on the previous comment as well, like whether different timelines were considered at all for when thinking about scenarios. I also see some potential challenges with trying to align deeper engagement with the timeline that was proposed around the report. And given what I've heard from some of the panelists just now around kind of the diversity of capacity and needs and fatigue, that really may be a challenge. And I'm kind of admittedly processing and thinking out loud. But I'm also, from a utility perspective, a little bit concerned about some of the timelines that were proposed, given the complexity of the material, the diversity of like sort of the capacity that's available to various orgs, and so on and so forth, which I think has been really well articulated today.
You're with Southern California Edison. I just want to make you say, I know the answer, but it's right.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Got it.
Okay. Timelines has been since the beginning of this proceeding with 3 parallel tracks moving together. Scheduling has been the number one concern, and so with this, we have about a year, a little less, to set up 5 technical workshops and incorporate additional engagement around those workshops. And so all of the proposals, the 3 options, include Energy Division staff seeking additional input from parties that are less technical or unable to attend a full workshop. And so that's being planned under all options. The question is hiring another consulting firm to then do additional outreach that can go farther than Energy Division staff can do, and also to make sure that once this draft study for the future grid is developed, there is meaningful and engagement on it as opposed to just the typical parties. Not that we don't appreciate all the typical parties that join us, but additional the folks that want to engage that just are unable to. So it'll require us to decide at the commission fairly quickly on whether or not to move forward with consultant funding and vote out a decision. And so that's going to have to happen, early next year, Q2, sort of maybe hopefully by the end of it, a decision could vote out. And then there's a hiring process. And so by the time the consultant is hired, I think what you're seeing is hopefully the draft future grid study has just been drafted, or is maybe a month later. It's hard to predict exactly how it will go. Predicting the future is hard to do in this proceeding. I've already learned that lesson several times. So the timing could align if everything works right. We may have to delay this or that a bit depending on the option. But I think the way we're seeing it is it looks possible, but the starting place really is moving quickly on getting a decision on adopting one of the options as soon as possible.
Thanks for offering some of the insights on how you've been thinking through this. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Anuj.
Let's jump to some questions that we have in the chat. We've got quite a few now. We have one from Lorene asking if we have additional written feedback, who will we submit it to? And I think the answer to that would be that we have a sorry, what's the word? Not a decision.
Ruling.
A ruling. Thank you. Coming out early next year that will be asking for written comments on this scope of work, as well as the options for the future grid study.
Right, and I'll just add, so Lorene may be thinking about whether or not she has a party status or access to a group with party status. And so for the ruling asking for formal comments, that's directed at parties to provide those formal comments. So one way to do it is, Lorene, if you're one of your colleagues or perhaps I think it's the Santa Monica, Climate Action, I can't remember the exact name of the organization, but maybe there's you're interested in becoming a party, which is it's not too late. That's one way. That's the more formal way. Another way, and we've talked to you already, and I'm so glad you joined us again today, you can send your comments directly to me and to Tyler. So those would be informal, but they still would be helpful feedback for us.
Great. Another question from Lorenzo Christov. When the IOU finishes its annual distribution planning process, does it submit its plan to the CPUC for approval? If not, how does the CPUC approval for IOU spending on the distribution planning process work? I can speak to a piece of this, which is the DIDIF. The CPUC has a framework with the utilities for deferring grid needs. And so we have this whole framework where the utilities release all of their grid needs in their grid need assessment, and then follow it up with their DDOR acronyms. Rob, can you jump in?
Yeah, it's Lorenzo. It's a good question, and I'll try to help with it. And I'm not sure exactly how familiar you are with all the ins and outs of the distribution investment deferral framework, the DIDIF, as of today. That process was established several years back, 2014, 2015, 2016 timeframe is when all that was developed. But in short, so distribution planning, the way, I don't have the slide with me today, but if you think about the process, you have the IPER, the utilities, I think presented a slide sort of like what I'm going to describe. The IPER, the demand forecast in the Integrated Energy Policy Report from the CEC drives the forecast. Then the utilities use that forecast to prepare a distribution plan, for what projects they need to build to ensure they can meet the forecast. And there's in community engagement pieces that flow into that distribution planning process as well. And then what the DIDIF does, the Distribution Investment Deferral Framework, is put a regulatory step in there, which reviews that distribution planning process outcome. So currently that DPP outcome, and I have to throw out more acronyms, I don't want to, but it's the filing, the regulatory filing that comes from distribution planning process is the grid needs assessment, GNA, and distribution deferral opportunity report, DDOR, GNA DDOR. It's a package report filing that goes to the PUC. So currently the CPUC doesn't approve the whole filing. They consider portions of that filing, and those are the ones that could defer traditional infrastructure. So like non-wires alternatives concepts. So currently the approval, the way I see it, is focused on approving non-wires alternatives approaches to traditional infrastructure. But an actual approval of the distribution planning process is not something I currently believe is built into that IPER to distribution planning to regulatory filing framework. So that just goes to approval of the plan, which includes different projects to build and the needs that drive them. And the next question is on spending. So that's even more complex because you have a whole nother set of proceedings, the general rate cases, which deal with approving spending. And there is a requirement for alignment between the projects and the costs in the distribution plan and what is being asked for in the general rate cases. Those should be the same when filed in the same year. I'm going to stop there because there is so much to unpack in that. And I'm not even sure if I addressed Lorenzo's comment in full. So if Lorenzo, if you're still there and you want to take the mic, feel free, and we can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, thank you for jumping in there, Rob.
Yeah, thanks. This is Lorenzo, and thanks, Rob. That was a valiant attempt and a good start. You know what and some of this comes from my years at the ISO because I was involved in reforming the transmission planning process there. It's also an annual process, at the end of which the entire plan goes to the Board of Governors for approval. And so I wondered if there was something like that comparable at the PUC. They finish an entire plan every year. Does that go in front of the PUC for approval? And it sounds like, I see you're shaking your head.
Not that I'm aware of, no, nothing like that.
Of that go to the commission for approval related to the possibility of non-wires alternatives. But the overall plan in general, I imagine then that the approval for that spending really comes out of the general rate case.
And that's every 4 years, every 4 years.
It's every 4 years. It's not every year on the annual plan that the utility creates. So I think it's kind of helpful to understand that because, you know, it's like when they asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? He said, well, because that's where the money is. And so some of this comes down to do the participants in the process understand where the money is being approved, where the spending is being approved. So I think it's just helpful to clarify that. And I'm sorry if this is a diversion from the mainstream here, but it seemed to me important to understand that.
Thank you, Lorenzo. No, I think that is helpful. And I'm sure there are, in terms of education, and there are people who want to know and that don't, but a lot of the folks don't understand that DIDIF process. It's complex and distribution planning process piece of it. And it needs to be looked at again. And this high DR proceeding that's within scope is to figure out how to make that process work better.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to highlight a comment from Roger Lynn, who says it is important to recognize the rates of engagement burnout with how meaningful the engagement was. Attending a lot of meetings is particularly tiring when opinions are solicited but never implemented. I think this is a very valid point, very important, and something that, you know, continues the conversation we've had ongoing today.
Tyler, I'm thinking, Stefan, if you're still on, this would be a good comment for you to think about from Mark Costa. It says, I'll read it, Stefan, and see if you've got thoughts. The DRP somewhat depend on ICA analysis. That's the distribution. I think the distribution resources plan.
Yeah, so I can jump in
Go ahead.
and handle this if you want. I already responded to Mark in chat, but it's very valid point. A lot of this builds off of the ICA maps. So a couple of thoughts is one, I do want to acknowledge the utilities do have plans in place to improve these, but there are plans under, for lack of a better term, the high DER work stream that my team's working on with CPUC. And the near-term action is developing a staff proposal early next year on near-term improvements to the ICA, well, all the data portals, but much of this is really going to be focused on the ICA maps. So point very well taken. We actually have, a number of things already identified. If you do have specific concerns or recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me. And then there will also be another technical report on the data portals, I believe, scheduled for 2024. I realize that sounds like a long way away, but again, we do have plans in place for a near-term improvement of those.
Thank you, Stefan.
Great. And I'll just add, Stefan, that, with resolution 5230 out there, that may significantly change the ICA maps, which is this thing of limited generation profile.
Yeah, no, so very, very aware of that. Francis, who's also on the high DR team, and I have been attending those workshops. So we are very aware of that and understand there might be implication. And that's one of the reasons this is pushed out a little bit, is because we want to make sure we can reflect any needed changes from that work, that process.
Stefan, can I skip down to one? We'll go back and forth. I was just reading through the whole list, and this one from Roger, let's see if we can think about what a response would be. It's an interesting question, or comment. He says, this proceeding considers the cost-effective deployment of DERs. The scope of work seems to develop certain non-energy benefits as metrics. Can the scope of work also help determine non-energy benefits to be factored into cost-effective determinations?
Potentially. I think the reason you're seeing me squirm a little bit is that I know that there are other CPUC proceedings on this that we would need to look at to make sure that's well coordinated. And Roger, I know that's not a perfect answer, but what I don't want to do, and I'm sure Rob does not want to do, is set up parallel streams that can come out with different answers. So I think that's a really valid point that I think looking at other, how that can be factored and how that could be looked at in concert with other proceedings is definitely an area that needs some consideration.
So I think the proceeding, to be more specific, is the one that just opened. It's the oh gosh, I can't
it's
think of the
DER
whole
framework or something. I should have this in front of me.
It's the customer programs DER.
I think they changed the name of it to cost effectiveness and appliance standards or something like that.
Yeah. So
I'll put an email, I'll put a link in the chat to the DER action plan, which envisions this, which is track 4 of that plan. And it had a different name when it opened, but now that the new proceeding is open, the name has, it is evolved. So, okay.
We have a fairly long and multi-parted question from Joseph Weedman, and I think to do it justice, I'd like to invite you to unmute and kind of talk us through.
Sure. This is, can you guys hear me?
Yes, you can.
Great. This is, excuse me. This is Joseph Weedman. I represent the joint CCAs in the docket, and I think today's conversation has been really great, and I look forward to providing comments on the statement of work. But, one thing that sort of struck me from especially the community panelists, Mr. Kennedy, was, he sort of laid out several instances of where, pretty significant delays have occurred in meeting distribution system upgrade needs. And, that's something the CCAs have raised somewhat off and on, and we're still trying to get a handle around. But the thing that struck me today in talking about that and thinking about the scope of work is the lack of some sort of comprehensive understanding of just how significant of a problem is this, right? We've got certain anecdotal evidence, and I was just reading in the Press Democrat the other day about a very significant project delay occurring in Santa Rosa that I'm sure local folks are extremely upset about. And so, when I think about sort of a scope of work and the community needs assessment, I mean, what we are consistently hearing from communities is the need for upgrades to occur in a more timely fashion that relates to reliability, resiliency, and their climate goals. And I don't expect that to change too much if we do a big giant community needs assessment. I think it'll be important as part of getting greater understanding of the situation. But part of what I think does need to be part of that is just some basic data around what is this issue? What is causing it? What have the utilities considered in the past to fix it? I mean, we heard some examples today from various folks, but having that in a more concrete discussion, I think, even if it's part of this report, is extremely important. Because I mean, like I said, I could issue data requests on this. I have a hunch what I'll get back is a certain amount of it is confidential. But I don't see it as something that the joint CCAs alone would benefit from understanding better. I think we all would, as we try to grapple with this issue and have a productive conversation. So I just wanted to lay out, I didn't want to put staff on the spot, but it's something that could be part of the scope of work. It could be something is sort of independent, but is going to be examined. But it just struck me today, hearing that.
I mean, there's a couple. Wait, I'll let you go first, Stefan. I got a couple thoughts.
I can add something while you think about it. So there is a partial data source for this, and that is that the utilities are required every quarter to submit their interconnection timelines. Now, admittedly, this is only for NEM customers, so it's only really for generation, I guess, storage in there. But those reports for NEM customers over 30 kW and the timelines of their interconnection process are made public in the R1707-007. I think that's Rule 21 proceeding. So that provides part of the data you're looking for, Joe. It's not the whole story. I'm just pointing out that part of that exists, and I think given the sort of expansive nature of some of the interconnection challenges that we heard, maybe further consideration is necessary, but I'll leave that to staff to on next steps. I just wanted to point out that some of that exists. I'll see if I can put a link in the chat.
Yeah, that's helpful, Stefan. And the thought I was going to add was a little bit different. It's actually about other data sources. I'm thinking of hosting capacity. Like what is the ability of the grid to host new interconnections, either generation or load? And that data is something we have a team at Kavala that's able to process and do analytics with and predict where new generation sources might be put, like new PV, propensity for adoption for new PV, or propensity for adoption for new EV, which could be load or generation. And so that report we're reviewing now and trying to get out as soon as we can. We'd hope would be this year, but this year is coming to close, so it may be early next year. That sounds more likely. But it's a first look at the scope and scale of electric vehicle loads and what that does to the grid and where there's capacity and where there isn't. And then they'll be doing an update on that report, which takes it a step further and considers mitigations. So I guess my point, I think this relates well, is that we have a significant amount of data from the utilities about what the grid is currently capable of hosting. And then we have to think through what we think will be interconnecting and what problems that will occur and then how to mitigate those. So I think it's another data source that we have and to help address this question. Joseph, was that helpful?
Accidentally logged off, but was able to log in quickly. You know, I definitely appreciate the responses. I mean, I guess and they're helpful. I mean, I'm aware of the NIM stuff, you know, but I still don't think it gets at, you know, what we're hearing from some local community members pretty consistently, that projects, for example, the one in Santa Rosa has been under development for 5 years. And apparently, you know, only now are they beginning to learn pretty significantly that they're going to have a 2-year delay on the last half of the project. I mean, we need to kind of understand better how those occurred. And again, like, you know, we have a limited budget and it's hard to sit there and think through spending significant money on that if it only benefits one party's understanding, right? And so I'm just wondering again, as part of and maybe it's something we need to consider and put in our comments, you know, as part of the scope of work, do we need to have a better understanding of this problem? And then that does relate to community engagement. How do we engage with communities to fix it in a sort of robust fashion? And it sounds like each of the utilities is doing something very different. So I'll give it more thought. I do appreciate the conversation, and I definitely don't want to dominate it.
Well, let's go. We have a little time, and I made me think of one more thing, and that's the concept of a known load application. And so I don't know how large the project in Santa Rosa is, but if it's large enough, they've let PG&E know about it, and in the form perhaps of an application, and that would be considered a load that they know about. And that's in contrast to a load that's forecast. It's not based necessarily on something known and tangible, an application for something, but a prediction of how the future will look based on the economy and you know, demographics and the kind of a forecast that the CEC does. And so this relationship between what is known and what is forecast based on history, we've got to come to a place where we are merging them more seamlessly. And the report I spoke about with Kavala, I think, is a step in the direction of merging those forecasting approaches, one based on real known loads and one based on historical growth, which we think will change. Historical growth is not necessarily a predictor of future growth, load growth with electric vehicles. So just one more thing I wanted to add. And John, if you have something, go ahead, Steph.
Question on that, is that application one for new load, or is that for generation, or all of the above? And I realize this is just one example, but
well, the project in Santa Rosa, as I recall it, is a series of warehouses that are being built. So they're very large buildings, and they've gotten about halfway through the project and are now being told that the last half of the project is going to need 2 to 3 years worth of upgrades. And I mean, it just really struck me, Mr. Kennedy, based on some of the observations you made about, you know, sort of various anecdotal things. It's like, I don't know if it's a node load issue. I don't know if it's a modeling issue. It's hard to sort of tease those out, given the information I've been able to see so far in the docket, so far in other dockets. You know, I'm aware of the NIM studies and other things, and people are clearly saying the hosting capacity and ICA stuff is not up to snuff. But again, you know, I think in order to understand how to advise people on changes, we're talking about the elephant from a number of different angles rather than actually what's a full holistic picture of the elephant, I guess is what I'm getting at, right? But I'll give it more thought. And, you know, certainly I think it's something, you know, we all continue to collectively talk about and understand at each one of these workshops. In each workshop, we get a little more information.
Go ahead, John.
So I just wanted to mention and provide a little more context. So some of these and the newer ones are dealing with vehicle charging, right? And so there are a lot of applications out there for vehicle charging, some delays associated with that, but it's broader than just that, larger in scale and much longer in duration. I think we've heard that some of these challenges significantly predated COVID, and so some of the supply chain disruptions aren't necessarily to blame, certainly for some of the problems today, but many of these problems existed before those supply chain disruptions as well. And in terms of scope, aside from vehicle charging, we're seeing distribution centers, we're seeing food processing centers, hospitals. There was a comment about a mental health clinic that was needing some power that was being delayed. Housing projects, either smaller scale housing developments or very large scale housing developments. And so I think there are a lot of challenges out there. There would be help. There would be some significant benefit from trying to compile a list of, what the typical narrative is given to various project applicants for how long it would take to connect something in some particular part of the state. Just so we can get a better picture of how to move forward, because the reaction so far, and I don't mean to pick on PG&E, was, Humboldt County had problems, and PG&E CEO had to go up to Humboldt County and try to solve the problems herself. Fresno County expressed similar concerns about the length of time it was taken to interconnect things, and had to threaten forming a POU to get PG&E to go out and respond. So I think that PG&E has a lot of priorities. It's been a challenge to focus on all priorities at the same time. And so I'll acknowledge that and give them that. But, trying to find a way that we as locals can help, some of that might be information sharing, where we can try and focus some development, some housing, things like that, through sharing some of this information, but also getting a better handle on what's the average across various utilities. And within various utilities for various different types of projects, not just vehicle charging, but everything across the board. I think that could be helpful.
And we had intended that with the second objective of how distribution utilities are meeting that, combined with the metrics, the scope of work was going to get at some of that. But I think we definitely hearing the feedback that there may be a desire to have a more definitive understanding of interconnection experience. There might be appetite for from some parties.
Bill, did you have thoughts?
I was just going to say thanks. I thought John Kennedy's points were really spot on. And we have heard a lot of the messages that have been relayed today. I'm speaking just Bill Peter of PG&E, should have clarified that. We do have to consider a lot of different priorities, but I think we do see this improved community engagement as a way to improve our performance here. So we are behind, improvements here, and including in the near term, we're ready to try to engage with these communities, get better insight as to what their plans are. And it's both like getting more certainty on what those interconnections are, and like how as we talked before, we can't just build for any speculative load. We have to plan for it, right? And so I think if we can get a better insight, that'll improve our planning processes and improve how we serve our customers. So we are really supportive of doing this, and including in the near term. I think, and so to the extent that this scope of work can help us on that, that'll be great. So just kind of agreeing and saying we're hearing what you guys are saying. So thanks.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks for that response. I want to make sure we get to Ben Schwartz, who has had their hand up for a minute now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Ben Schwartz from the Clean Coalition. I just want to echo comments made about the importance of data sharing. And I tried to ask a question about this earlier, and I think it was interpreted as, kind of the central question or a central question for this this phase of the proceeding. But I guess specifically what I was trying to get to is there are kind of two ways that information can flow. One is, from the regulatory agencies, like the IPR forecast to the utilities. And the other is, from customers to the utilities about where projects want to be. But I guess the thing that we haven't really been addressing as much is, what can the utilities deliver to help communities make those choices in a more effective way that benefits both parties. As businesses electrify, it'll be great to have hosting capacity information. Sure, that will define where a lot of these choices are made, but conversations with the utility and a greater amount of data sharing about things like interconnection issues for front of the meter interconnection, or where limited generation profiles can be of help. I think those are things that the utility can also benefit from sharing, and so it's worth taking a look at some of those issues or places where confidentiality is listed as an issue. And it seems to me that it would be effective in a lot of areas to have businesses opt in or customers opt in to having their information shared to a certain extent rather than opting out.
Thank you for that. Looks like we've finished most of the questions in the chat. I would like to highlight something, a message that Mark Costa submitted, that any local government can reach out to LGSEC, which is a nonprofit membership group that represents local governments. And we typically submit party comments based on feedback. So that's a kind offer. I just wanted to make sure that that was heard.
That's a good one to point out. Thanks, Tyler.
Mark, could you share your contact info if you haven't, so people can contact you?
I think you left the chat. That's what I see, Mark. Yeah.
Okay. Of course.
He's easy to find, though. Mark Costa on the internet. I'll tell you, he's not. He's there.
We do have one more comment. This might be the last one, or one more question, sorry, from LaPierre. How short-staffed are IOUs that these delays are happening, especially at PG&E? I can't speak to that, but maybe we can have a response.
This is Bill Peter with PG&E. It's a complicated question. I wouldn't say that simplifying it to like a short staffing. There's probably a lot, as we talked through, that is an aspect of planning and looking at, and then we talked about how the grid is getting a lot more complex, right? And so how to prepare for that. And then a lot of different things we have to consider as we go through our planning. So, and there's always our resource constraints. That's true, but I wouldn't want to try to say that like it's just a staffing issue. Now qualified resources right now, like is something, right? Like having engineers and trained engineers with experience. It's not easy to hire that in the market right now. So that I'd say that's part of it, but I wouldn't want to try to simplify it as just a staffing issue.
Thank you, Bill.
I might also note and just call out in response to Sam White's comment about that we only had one summary slide in this presentation about the concerns raised in the outreach meetings. I do want to just call out for everybody, Appendix A of the document that Tyler shared yesterday or last night is a summary of those outreach meetings. So there's a lot more information in that. It doesn't get down to this person said this, but it does group those responses by the group that was saying it, and also a verbose listing of who was contacted when, or what groups were contacted and when.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. I don't think we have any more questions, and we are about time for wrapping up with some next steps. So I would like to move on over to that. You should be able to see my screen. Can I just get a confirmation? I'm going to assume that's a yes. I just want to revisit these slides and remind everyone that we have key deliverables coming up and what the future is looking like for this proceeding. So in track 1, we have the distribution planning community engagement needs assessment that we've been talking about today, with the team being hired in 2023 to conduct the needs assessment and report their findings over the course of 2024, which will inform a decision at the end of 2024 for improvements to the distribution planning process, as well as the track 2 future grid study that we've talked about throughout the process today, being the technical workshops being all throughout 2023, and there will be stakeholder engagement to review and comment on the draft study, and the comments that we receive on this draft scope of work will inform how that additional engagement will be conducted. So for more next steps, look out for the ruling forthcoming in the first quarter of 2023, asking for public comments on this draft scope of work presented, and for choosing the option for the future grid study community feedback plan. Once again, the technical workshops all through 2023, and as well the decision considering the draft scope of work next year as well. And I would just like to remind everybody that you can sign up for the service list for this proceeding by following this link. All of the content from today's workshop will be distributed at a later date, so this will be available. And you can also become a party to the proceeding by following this link. We also have some ways to add comments to parties that already exist in this proceeding. If you're a local government, you can contact Mark Costa as he suggested. So those are the next steps, and thank you for attending this workshop.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Sounds like that is a wrap. I don't see other questions or comments. So again, I'll offer my thanks. Thank you everyone for attending today.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. See you soon.